This is Voice to Culture, a podcast for the modern-day confused citizen.
Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Helen.
I'm Kelly.
I'm Michelle.
I'm Carolyn.
And I'm Amy.
Today, we'll be debating the increasingly controversial subject of affirmative action, specifically with the ACA-5 Bill. Before we begin, we'd like to make a short disclaimer. Some of the contents covered in this episode are based on opinionated ideas and beliefs. Please fact-check everything before forming conclusions. With that said, I'll briefly explain what affirmative action is. According to Merriam-Webster, affirmative action is, quote, an active effort to improve the employment or educational opportunities of members of minority groups, end quote. The idea behind affirmative action is to give minorities equal access to opportunities that the majority group would have access to.
This November, California voters are given a choice of whether to restore affirmative action in their state or not. The ACA-5 Bill, also known as the Assembly Constitutional Amendment No. 5, was passed on June 10, 2020 in a 6-14 vote. The bill pushes to repeal Proposition 209, which is a California ballot proposal passed in November of 1996. This prohibited institutions from considering race, sex, or ethnicity, specifically in public appointment, public contracting, and public education admissions. It also allows affirmative action to be restored. This is a concept tackling the issue of equity versus equality. In equality, you're providing the majority and minority groups with the same amount of resources. In equity, you're providing groups resources based on their needs. For now, I wanted to ask you guys if you think affirmative action is inherently good or bad.
I feel like affirmative action as an idea is good, but then like when you actually put it into effect, I feel like it's not really effective much.
Would you say that this policy of affirmative action is just combating racism with more racism? And if you don't think it's effective, to what extent? And on the other side, do you think there's a more effective way to promote diversity in education?
So I think inherently, like characteristic-wise, like it is good because the idea behind it is good. But when in practice, I don't think it's as effective because, like Michelle said, because like the whole like combating racism with racism thing, like I feel like it's pushing Asians out of college admissions because like the reason why these specific minorities like Black and Hispanic and like other minorities are not being admitted to like college as much is because the opportunities aren't there within their communities. And so the way that we should help these minorities out is to provide more opportunities like from the jump, like when they're in school, like before college, whereas giving more opportunities when it comes to admissions, that I feel like pushes Asians out.
Just speaking on like equity versus equality, like I think right now, because in our nation we have a lot of systemic racism going on, and so that basically means that people who are born with like a certain ethnicity are more likely to not have the same access to the opportunities that someone say like a white person would have. So I think that the idea of equity is good because then you're trying to like focus on how like specifically like recently there was the Black Lives Matter movement that's being brought up, and so now that the laws are starting to like cater towards the general public's concern, I think that at least we know that the government is considering like what we're fighting for. But at the same time, what confuses me is how the fact that we have to almost in a way like bring others down to lift up others, if that makes sense. I feel like what confuses me the most is how specifically in college admissions and in the workplace and other institutions, they'll start considering race, which confuses me because like for example, like if someone who was Asian applied for the same job as like a Black person, and then the Asian person was more qualified for the job, and then the Black person was hired just because of their race. And I'm not to say that like inherently Black people are stupid, because I think that Black people are actually very intelligent, and that stereotypically people assume that they aren't, but in reality a lot of them are, and a lot of them are very eloquent and have a good head on their shoulders. But I'm just saying in this situation, if one person was more qualified than the other, but they were denied of the job because of their race, I feel like that's a little racist itself. And I do agree with the fact that like affirmative action may be a little like fighting fire with fire. It's almost like very utilitarian. Do the ends really justify the means, you know?
I like to bring up this YouTube comment actually that I saw. Yeah, it says, we should be more concerned with equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. And so that kind of goes back to what Amy and Helen said earlier, that it might initially seem unfair that like race is now being considered a factor. So overrepresented groups at like the workforce and like at colleges, so like whites and Asians will now have quote unquote less of a chance. But I feel like this affirmative action policy, although it is, yeah, like, as you guys said, affirmative action is trying to promote like diversity and trying to make the workforce and the world better. It's not enough on its own. We really do need to tackle the issue of systemic racism by following up with providing more opportunities in public education, providing like the resources to get different groups and different backgrounds to where they need to go, instead of just giving them the spots because they need to fill diversity. Because at the end of the day, if you're only keeping someone in your group or in your institution because you want diversity, but you don't actually care about continuing to foster that diversity on campus and in like the workplace, then aren't you just trying to make yourself look good?
Yeah, you basically like I've seen a lot of stuff where like companies and stuff, or even like social media, where like you just throw in one person of color and then it like suddenly like, oh wow, we're so diverse. Like you're not treating them as people, you're treating them more as trophies to show off and to try to make yourself look good.
Yeah, I agree. I think that affirmative action is only effective to a certain extent. I think that if like California really wanted to like increase diversity in higher education and the workforce, they should like create bills that like ban stuff like legacy systems that like give preferential treatment to like students who have like family or like just like relatives that are like either attending the school or like are working at that prestigious school, because that gives like preference to those who are like more wealthy than other students that like are qualified as well. And like another thing they can do is just provide more funding to like schools in poorer neighborhoods, like put more emphasis on K-12 education, because studies have shown like in the past that like if students do well in like when they're like in elementary and like middle and high school, they are more likely to go on to like higher education and stuff. And I think if California really wants more diversity, in that they should focus more on educating their like the children, and that will give more opportunity to the people.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like we really have to like start from the beginning and build up from there. I know that there's like people who say that affirmative action shouldn't happen because like we already have equality, but that's not to say that like some employers or some people in the admissions office don't like look at someone's like race and then like still choose whether or not they permit someone to be accepted based on that. I do think that affirmative action, it's required right now because our system is still broken and we need to change. But what I think is that the ACA-5 bill, it's a little perplexing and it does have its own issues, but at least we're making some progress.
I do want to bring up this one page that I saw on Instagram called Asian Students at Risk. So basically the page kind of talks about how Asian students will be negatively impacted by this bill because they claim that there's a 12% cap on how many Asians will be admitted to like the UC schools in particular in California. And just for some of you who don't know, like in the actual bill, there's no quote on any race or any background. It just simply says that race, ethnicity, and like where you come from, basically your character and your background will play a role and will be considered during admissions. But it doesn't necessarily say that Asians alone will be persecuted or targeted.
Do you think that Asian students might be discriminated against if they're more qualified? As in, like, for example, what if someone in their essay talks about how their parents were like really hard on them as a child to like overachieve, and then they finally like realized that they were working hard for themselves, and then like what if the person who's reading their essay in the admissions office might be like, oh well, you're Asian, so of course your parents are like that, you know? What if like the idea that someone that looking at someone's race can help them in the admissions, what if that like only perpetuates the people in the admissions to hold it against like the applicant's head because of their race? What do you guys think about that?
Like, I know what you mean. Like, they're probably just gonna enforce even more stereotypes. So I feel like again, going back to how like we should provide more funding towards like K-12 education, and like going back to like the roots of the problem, I don't think we should really like put race on your application, because again, like, it's confusing on how like that helps. Like, you should be putting, if you look at the problem, like the whole reason why those minorities are targeted is because of where they come from, and so you should put more. So if once you put you give equity to that point, and like once it's the opportunities are even, then the result of it and the admissions will be equal.
So I noticed that some people on the internet are arguing that admissions should be not race-based, it should be based on socioeconomic status, so how much income you make. And while I think that's a valid point, that like how much you make has a correlation with how successful you are in education, the only problem with that is that like for schools that are need aware, like colleges that are need aware, they will take into account how much you make as whether or not they'll accept you. And so that just kind of goes into a problem of like how much you get from FAFSA, how much money your parents make, and stuff like that. So
I feel like by like changing it into like a socio-economic thing, that's like kind of playing more into like capitalism in a sense. Like you're not gonna like do it based on race, but you're still gonna do it based on like how much money you have or which like your social status is. And I feel like that still isn't like right either, in my opinion. Because there could be like someone who's like at the bottom of the barrel could just be as qualified as someone at the top of the barrel. But at the same time, you shouldn't just like admit them based off of that status, you know? I feel like that's why I think that's what like conflicts me the most on the ACA-5 bill is because just by like not looking at the race, like someone might not be able to like, for example, like if two students wrote about the same topic, obviously like the essay that's more well written, that flows more, should be chosen. But then like once you put race into it, like the essay that isn't as well written or doesn't flow as nicely might get chosen because of that, when in reality once you like remove color from it, you're just based on like the skills that each essay has condensed. Like you can just like judge based off like the writing style and how well spoken the person is through the essay. But then by like inserting race into it, you're kind of just like judging them based on their color, which is still, to me, it's still kind of just as prejudice.
I feel like if you favor one group of people, it's not beneficial to them as well, because like say for example, like let's say like if a poor person were to get into a prestigious school because they were favored because of their social economic status, and like then like it won't benefit them either because they were poor, they weren't given like these resources to be able to like prepare to go into like this advanced educational setting, and like they might fall behind or like they won't be ready to take on this setting and new chapter. They weren't given the resources beforehand, and that just goes back into what we said earlier about like emphasizing K-12 education and funding them. If the child is not given to learn in like their earlier years, if you favor them and like have them be accepted to go to your school, there's a higher chance of them dropping out because they can't take the pressure. They can't work in like this setting.
It goes back to like the whole like colleges are trying to make themselves look good. Like USC, for example, when they had that whole scandal where students like just paid money to get into the school and then they got caught, and then now this year for the upcoming school year they are providing free tuition to low-income students, and they never did that before, like the whole scandal. And so it comes off as like ingenuine, and they're just trying to give low income students like the opportunity. But I mean, before that, like students who had money could just get in, and like free tuition sounds great until like obviously nothing is free, so like all those student loans pile up.
I also definitely agree with Carolyn, because then like the purpose of GPAs and like grades are to see whether or not the student's prepared to enter that college, right? If you're only selecting like that one student because of their race, they're not gonna end up being prepared So yeah, it just sets like a drawback to all the applicants.
One thing that I have like question is by like choosing someone just because of their race, isn't that like a little patronizing? Because it's kind of like you have your class run a mile, and then like the last person to finish the mile is a girl, and then the coach is like, oh, it's okay, you know, like you're a girl, I'll still pass you because girls can't run as fast. Isn't that a little patronizing in the same way that you'll still accept someone just because of their race?
Yeah,
You're not as qualified, but like you're black, so I'll accept you. And I don't think that's like inherently good in that way. But I do understand the idea behind affirmative action.
Okay, I was going to ask you guys, Amy's analogy was really interesting because in that scenario, like running in a way represents like applying to college, applying to jobs. And like obviously running a mile, just like getting a college education can be beneficial in terms of like your professional career. But is it necessarily the only option? Do you have to go to college? You could do other forms of exercise like biking or like swimming, just like how you can do like trade schools and like do other professional careers that don't require a college education. So is college really necessary?
Yeah, I do definitely think that like a lot of people have put a lot of pressure on new generations to go to college to succeed. And as a student who was in vocational school, I do definitely feel like it helped me grow like as a person, because it helped me realize what I want in life and what I want in my career paths. And I do think that as like a society, we should push students for other paths, but at the same time, we shouldn't like push like kids to become a YouTuber, you know, or to just like not work hard, you know. Like I think that we should push the younger generation to work hard and to do the most that they can for their future, but at the same time, we shouldn't like not tell them to not do anything.
Okay. Yeah, so that was a really good point. Could I expand on my question actually? Do you guys think that going to these elite colleges like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Ivy Leagues, like all these top tier colleges, is that what our society is pressuring us to do in a way that like we shouldn't necessarily follow? Because like these elite colleges have the connections and have the resources to like support underrepresented groups, but that doesn't necessarily mean these underrepresented groups are going to feel welcomed or even like feel like they belong there. And yes, there are like some people who come out like more successful, they climb the social ladder, but what about all the people who didn't get in or all the people who aren't on that path? How do we help them?
So first off, what I want to say is, yeah, for sure, I think there definitely needs to be more representation in the more prestigious colleges, especially like the Ivy Leagues. Like I haven't really thought about it that way, you know. I just thought about it in like the UC system, but I didn't like think beyond that, because honestly, like Ivy Leagues are kind of out of my own vision. But I do definitely think that we should push groups that are like perceived to be in the Ivy League circle to like be there, because there definitely needs to be more diversity, and there definitely needs to be more people. There needs to be more minority groups like distributed across like all different sections of the ladder. And as a whole, I do think that people at first, when you first, because of this affirmative action, it might be a little sudden. So just by like abruptly allowing race to be factored into admissions might make someone feel alienated, especially in like a prestigious and a competitive atmosphere like an Ivy League would have. And just knowing like how it feels to be suddenly like pushed into an environment you're not used to, I definitely think this just makes me feel like stronger about how we really need to encourage kids when they're young and give them resources while they're young so that they can choose their own path and like decide which is the best for them. Because when you don't give someone like the different options when they're young, then they won't know what there is out there until they're like much older.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think we should just stop putting so much emphasis on prestigious colleges, because like other colleges, such as like, you know, state universities, they have the same capabilities as these prestigious colleges, you know? They offer the same curriculum and the classes are relatively the same. And I feel like the only difference between the two is the brand name, you know? Because even when you go to like a college that's not necessarily like prestigious, you still gain like many opportunities, you know? But there's like that kind of stigma that makes it seem as if like if you don't go to a prestigious school, you're gonna become a failure, you know? You're not going to achieve as much success as if you were to go to a prestigious college.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. I know growing up in a family that was very competitive and very education focused, like in almost like prestige centered. I know that it's what it's like to just focus on what it's like to have the title of going to like a school with a really low acceptance rate. And I think that the reason why all these schools are hyped up is because of this low acceptance rate and because of the name that they've built for themselves. And I know that like schools are kind of like they're only pushed in families because of the name that they've like made for themselves because of their low acceptance rate. And because of that, by making a name for themselves, employers are more likely to recognize it on a resume than they are to accept someone who went to community college, you know? But that shouldn't undermine the quality of the education that someone went through, regardless of which school they went to, you know? Like, even though like someone went to an Ivy League, they might not have learned as much as someone who went to community college and like took time to figure out what their path was. Like someone who went through community college might have like more time to figure out which path they want to go to, and they might feel more passionate about the career that they've chosen for themselves, as opposed to someone who is immediately like pushed to go to a prestigious school and they don't really have anything else to going for them.
And like the whole thing about how like most prestigious schools are private schools, which means you have to pay more. And like, yes, like while you have financial aid, like again, student loans add up. So to get into a prestigious schools, like you have to pay so much money, and like the curriculum across the board is the same. It just depends on, I guess, like professors and the environment that each school provides. But just because like when you're looking at two resumes, like if you see one school that is like a community college and versus an Ivy League school, the person's most likely going to go towards the Ivy League school. But you don't know like how each person performed. You just see the name of the school and you're automatically drawn to it. And I don't know, it just seems unfair.
So according to an article from Harvard Business Review, quote, Goldman Sachs reported that 27% of its U.S. professional workforce was Asian American, but only 11% of its U.S. executives and senior managers and none of its executive officers were, end quote.
I just want to ask, what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I guess it just shows how like college admissions versus when you're actually in the workforce is a lot different, because again, like the affirmative action argument is that like there are too many Asians, I guess, like getting admitted into colleges. But then once you go out in the workforce, you see that Asians aren't in the workforce as much because systemic racism is still a thing, even against Asians. And I don't know, like, I guess, like, what do people perceive Asians as? Like, I guess weak, maybe, like nerdy, whatever.
Complacent,
So,
like comfortable with where they are in the position, stuff like that.
Yeah, so like when for college they're like, okay, you're smart, whatever, and then in the workforce you're like, whatever, we could just place you there. Because like even with my own family and like just Asians in general, I feel like we don't really argue, because like coming from like an immigrant family, you already feel lucky where you are and you don't want to fight for more. But it's like so unfair, like you work so hard and you can't just like be placed at a lower position and like you don't fight for more because you deserve more.
And that's not to say that like, and I'm not trying to like invalidate anyone else at all, but I do want to like point out how like Asians are kind of alienated from society in a way, because sure, we're also like persons of color, but like there's also been a new acronym for Black, Indigenous people of color to like specifically like single out that group. And then there's also like white people who don't even like see us as one of them. And Black, Indigenous people certainly don't see us like as aligned with them as like we should be. So we're kind of like in that gray area, and it does make us like feel like alienated. And that's why you don't see like a lot of Asians being represented, because people don't really like see us as a part of like the community or anything like that. And because of that, like it feels like we don't really have like a say or a voice to push in things like the ACA-5 bill, for example.
I think the reason why we are always overlooked is that we tend to have access to opportunities with like jobs more in like the workforce, but they are not given the mobility to move up the social ladder. I feel like that's why you always see them as like layout engineers or like jobs like that, but you don't see them as like anything higher, like an executive officer or like someone in like the management department. I think it has to do with the fact that like we're not always seen as like leaders. We're always seen as like someone's like that's happy with where they are. But that also is like pretty damaging, because that's why you never see Asian representation, because they are not given the opportunity for promotion.
I just want to add on that Asian racism is also often normalized, because we're also made fun of as well, but then their actions are seen as more as like justifiable, because I don't know how to explain it though. Oh my god. Okay.
Because it's not exactly to the severe extent of Hispanic, Latino, and Black communities where they're being persecuted violently for just the color of their skin. But at the same time, like, Asians are just always seen as like the butt end of the jokes, and they're just too sensitive to see chink as something funny for other communities, when in reality we really do need to step up and calling out these microaggressions and standing up for our own community, because who else is going to stand up for us if not ourselves?
Exactly. Drawing back to what I said about how Asians often are kind of in like the gray area in terms of, especially since there's almost like an extreme ends of the scale, with like some demographics being extremely oppressed because of our systemic racism, and then like one side that's benefiting from the system, and we're kind of in the middle. But that's not to say that there's still wrongs being committed against us. We should still call out toxic behavior in our community. For example, I know there's like this Facebook group called Subtle Asian Traits, and I know, and like it's a good Facebook group. Like there's some good memes from time to time, but I still see like sometimes I still see some like jokes that are too far. Like there will be jokes that like talk about how like Asian parents who are like strict or like too strict, borderlining like abuse, like and it like almost like the fact that it's like a meme and that so many people like laugh at it, it kind of undermines the fact that that's still kind of a toxic thing to do. Like you shouldn't just be laughing at the fact that some Asian parents are kind of abusive. You should be like, you shouldn't normalize it like that, you know? And talking about how like we should stand up against like racism towards us, because like there will be people who still exert microaggressions. I know that like I've seen people who post a lot of Black Lives Matter posts, and then they have like Ching Chong in their like username, and that like just like frustrates me. It's like, how hypocritical can you be? You say fuck racism, but then you have a racist username. I just want to like point out that like I feel like, for example, like cultural appropriation. If like a Black person were to wear like a traditional Vietnamese dress called an ao dai incorrectly, people might not be as quick to call them out versus like someone who usually benefits off of systemic racism like a white person is. But at the end of the day, whether or not a Black person or a white person is disrespecting a culture, you should still call them out on it.
Yeah, I do agree with Amy, because then like some of the people that were protesting about the Black Lives Matter movement, where were you guys when like the coronavirus started, you know? Because then there were so many attacks on like Asian markets and like Asian businesses and like just Asian people in general.
I completely agree. Like, you cannot be selective about the anti-racism that you choose to participate in, because when you pick and choose what aspects of racism you want to fight against, you're in a way perpetuating these stereotypes. Like, let's come back to the model minority myth. Asians are such a diverse community. You have like East Asians, like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and you also have like Pacific Islanders, like Filipino, Southeast Asians, like Laotian communities who don't necessarily receive the same treatment that East Asians do. And by reducing the Asian community all to a Chinese virus, or to just hardworking individuals who don't want to step out of line and take the big risk to go for that executive position, you are completely limiting the potential of an entire group. And in some ways, like, the stereotype is damaging.
Yeah, the history of like racism against Asians is a lot, especially like even just like, I don't know, like in California, like when you think of California, you think like, oh, like yeah, there's so many Asians here, but like back then, like there was so much racism. Like just like for one example, like just the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I guess that brings us to like the model minority
I feel like the affirmative action thing, it's sort of just promoting the model minority myth. Why are we held at a higher disadvantage because we're Asian, you know?
I do feel that like some people might say that like, oh, in like Asian culture, parents push you to be like very successful and be like and to be an overachiever. And I do believe that like if anything, this might like cause more pressure on this generation and future generations to like be more special than they could ever be, and to like do as much work as you can right now and to like burn out, but it's going to be okay because in the future you'll be happy. Like I feel like that if anything, like we should encourage students to not feel pressured to do that and like to do it just for the sake of doing it and not just so you can get into college and for your future. If anything, like it really worries me that like the system has come to this point where it's become a requirement to do like X amount of hours of community service and to like have to do sports and also be a principal honor roll student.
I feel like with like the SATs and how UCs are like not requiring it anymore also makes it harder, especially for like our class, like class of 2021. And there are a lot of students who have spent years studying for the SAT, and then now like we're seniors and we have to fill out college apps. But what if like all this time like we didn't have time to like build our character and we like focus on SATs, but now like we have like a few months to like build our character. But like what even is our character, because we don't have time. Like the system like doesn't really emphasize like character until you get into college and you're expected to have all those attributes about yourself. But how can you find yourself and what you're interested in if all this pressure is put into like so much that you have to get good grades, you have to get a lot of service hours, you have to also like have some sort of thing you're passionate about, and that's just so much to focus on. And yeah, which goes back to just, like the funding of lower income and like students put at a disadvantage, because like even though yes, if you don't have like money to pay for I guess like SAT tutoring, there's still like less opportunity to even like build your character, I guess, and like to have extracurriculars. That still, those advantages still go towards like higher income families because they have access to those facilities, whereas like minorities might not have access to those because there isn't enough funding in their schools. And yeah.
I also want to add on how school doesn't, or at least public schools, don't necessarily teach you the skills that colleges are looking for when it comes to finding a job. So like maybe that's creating a resume, networking with adults, and building good relationships, building that character that colleges want to see. It kind of just goes back to how the college application is you packaging yourself in a way that shows you are an ideal fit for that school. And with so many students having access to like college counselors, having access to these resources that helps them shape their character better than someone who doesn't, it just goes to show how even the subjectivity of having a character can be crafted. So overall, would you guys say that affirmative action is a good policy that helps bring equity and bring underrepresented groups into like higher opportunities? Or do you think that we should implement other policies instead of affirmative action?
I feel like the basic idea itself is good, but I think we need a better way to make it happen.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think for now, it might be good temporarily, but what happens when everyone becomes equal? And that's not to say that things will ever become equal, but what will happen when objectively minority groups have the same opportunities as a majority group would have? Would affirmative action only like push the minority groups to be seen as superior to majority groups, or what else will happen? Because that makes me feel like a little uncertain about like the long-term effects.
Yeah, I don't even know if we like should implement this in the first place though. It's so corrupt that like you can't reform it. You have to like abolish it and build from the start. With affirmative action, like I don't know, like it might be good temporarily, but there would be a lot of reform needed, and I don't know if like it's possible like to do all that, because so instead of giving opportunities in admissions, you should give more opportunities for students growing up.
I think affirmative action alone wouldn't be enough, but it is a step in the right direction, considering that colleges probably already considered factors like your background, like your demographic, where you're geographically located. If you are a legacy student, like did you donate a building? Like they already considered those background factors into your character and into your admission. But now that they're outright stating it, I think it's going to be really interesting to see, especially in conjunction with COVID-19 canceling like SAT, ACT test submission policies to see what colleges are looking for in students.
All right, that wraps up our discussion on the ACA-5 bill. Again, some of our commentary is opinionated and based on personal beliefs, but please note that our best interest is to start a conversation and spread information. We encourage others to thoroughly research the situation, to express their voice, and to actively participate in their community.
We'll make sure to link all of our sources that we gathered on the ACA-5 bill in the description below. If you're interested in what we do and want to better understand what we're about, please check out all our socials. All ads are at Voice to Culture.
If you like this episode, please give us a review or like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to be notified every time we upload a video.
Thank you so much for listening.
We'll be back with another episode. Please stay safe and healthy everyone.
Bye!
Bye.
Bye.